Oh, let's go. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus.
Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death.
Saint Gabriel,
Pray for us.
Saint Paul.
Pray for us.
All right. Well, I have been asked to give you a summary of the history of the church in 4 sessions. And let me give you a summary of the history of the church in 5 minutes. And then if you are still interested, we can proceed from there. Well, first, I might say a very quick history of the church. This is given by St. Joan of Arc about the year 1438. This is at the end of the 100 Years' War between England and France. And she's been taken prisoner by the English, and the Burgundians were allies of the English, and put on trial. It's a church ecclesiastical court for heresy, witchcraft. So they ask her, this young girl, 18 years old, without education, they ask her to, they kind of give her questions, theologically oriented questions, to see if they can catch her in some heretical statement. So they ask her about the relationship between Christ and the church. And her answer is one of the quotations, my favorite quotation from the Catechism of the Catholic Church, the 1992 Catechism, which you all are familiar with. St. Joan says, well, about Christ and the church, I will only say that they are one and the same, and that we shouldn't complicate the matter. Christ is the church. That's kind of just a wonderful insight. So that when we're talking about the history of the church, we are talking about the life of Christ extended over the centuries and over the face of the earth. This is well expressed by a man 100 years ago, 1911, named Robert Hugh Benson, who was a convert to the Catholic religion, the son of the Archbishop of Canterbury. So his conversion undoubtedly was something of a scandal. And he wrote, one of his books is called Christ in the Church. It's a book I strongly recommend. If you can, you should read it for your spiritual reading sometime. And in the first chapter, he formulates the thesis. You let us sum it up in one sentence. You might say, this is all that we really want to express. Let us sum it up in one sentence. Catholics believe that as Jesus Christ lived his natural life on earth 2,000 years ago in a body drawn from Mary, so he lives his mystical life today in a body drawn from the human race in general, called the Catholic Church. That her words, the church's words, are his, her actions his, her life his, with certain restrictions and exceptions. As surely as were the words, actions, and life recorded in the Gospels. It is for this reason that they give to the church the assent of their faith, believing that in doing so, they are rendering it to God himself. She, the church, is not merely his vice regent on earth, not merely his representative, not merely even his bride. In a real sense, she is himself. Again, that intuition of Joan of Arc. Christ and the church are one and the same. That in this manner, as he fulfills his promise to be with his disciples all the days, even to the consummation of the world. To express this position under another aspect, it may be said that God expressed himself in terms of a single life in the Gospels and of a corporate life in the church. And then he goes on to show how this is illustrated in the parable of the vine and the branches. I am the vine, you are the branches. Now, at the same time, excuse me, yes. The book is called Christ in the Church by Robert Hugh Benson. Now, it may not be easily available. I mean, it was written in 1911. Now, here this is what this emphasizes is, you might say, the invisible aspect of the church. The church is both visible and invisible. Divine, invisible, and human. A dragnet with all kinds of fish collected inside. A wheat field with many weeds or tares. Built on a rock. And of course, we know that that rock was Simon, who was renamed by Jesus Rocky, Petros, Peter. You are Peter, and on this Peter, on this rock, I will build my church. The famous text in the 16th chapter of St. Matthew. The gates of hell will not prevail against it. They will try to prevail against it. And at some points in these 2,000 years, it may seem that they almost succeed. For example, what is known as the Iron Age of the papacy of the late 10th century. Dreadful time. It was right sort of smack in the middle of the Dark Ages. Or the Renaissance papacy. Or the time of in the 14th century, when the church suffered a great schism, split in two. Or the 16th century, the age of the Reformation. So we have to review all of that. So you begin with the story told by the Acts of the Apostles, which is an extraordinary document. Wonderful, wonderful book. Read it over and over and over again. To a large extent, it's a story of Peter, the first 12 chapters, and then the remainder is the story of Paul. Peter and Paul, who each of whom ends up in Rome. Explicitly so, it's not explicitly stated in the case of Peter. Just go to the 12th chapter. And he said, this is after his release, and a miraculous release from prison, Peter said, "Tell this to James and to the brethren." Then he departed and went to another place. And that's the end of Peter's story in the Acts of the Apostles. It doesn't say what was that other place. Of course, tradition has always maintained that that other place was, well, eventually Rome itself. Because early in the life of the church, people were making pilgrimages to the tomb, what they would refer to as the trophy, kind of the triumphal trophy of Peter and Paul. Paul clearly was executed, beheaded on the road to Ostia, the Ostian Way outside of Rome. Peter, the ancient tradition was executed on Vatican Hill. What is the archaeological evidence of that? Well, for one thing, when Constantine the Great, 3 centuries later, when he determined to build a basilica, the first of the basilicas that is erected on Vatican Hill. Of course, they had to move a huge amount of earth to create a level place because Peter was apparently buried on the side of that hill, which would have been an absurd thing to do unless there was some special reason for orienting the basilica over this site on the side of the slope of the Vatican Hill. And a priest named Gaius, around the year 200, writes that people were going there to pay their respects to Paul in the Ostian Way and to Peter in the Vatican Hill. And of course, that site continued to be a kind of a special place of pilgrimage throughout the centuries. And various churches were eventually built on top of that site, including the post-Renaissance basilica that we have today. In 1939, Pope Pius XII authorized excavations underneath the confession altar of St. Peter's, where the discovery was made of a mausoleum, a kind of a city of the dead. And within that mausoleum, a shrine that was clearly, which dates back to the 1st century, and which allowed the Pope later, 1955, to proclaim to the world that the burial place and the bones of St. Peter have been discovered. This is all, I mean, this is not all matter of faith, but this is, fairly reliable archaeological certainty. And there, well, there you have kind of the rock on which the church would be built. So there's that story. Paul's story was a little bit more straightforward, at least in terms of documentation, because we have all the history of his travels and of the trials of St. Paul, and of the people who collaborated with him. The Acts of the Apostles gives us a wonderful feel for the real life people that come into play in the sort of adventures of St. Paul. The ones that are kind of my favorites are the married couple named Prisca. Her name is always given first, Prisca or Priscilla, and Aquila. They first appear in the story after St. Paul, his attempt to evangelize Athens, his great discourse on the Areopagus, this place in Athens where the philosophers would gather to discuss things. After that famous discourse, the Acts of the Apostles says that Paul went to Corinth. He didn't have much success with the Athenians. He went to Corinth, where he stayed for 18 months, working with this couple who were of the same industry, same trade. They were tent makers. I think of them as sort of people like St. Paul who were in the travel business. Tent making, I mean, was an important part of the travel business. You didn't have holiday inns or motels. You had to bring your own motel. You bought it from Paul or from Aquila. And there he spent 18 months. Then the Acts of the Apostles said that he went with them. They moved from Corinth, which was the main commercial city in Achaia, Greece. They went from there to Ephesus, where they continued to play an important role, Prisca and Aquila, which is recorded also in the Acts of the Apostles, when a very celebrated intellectual from Alexandria, Jewish intellectual named Apollos, came and was dazzling the crowd. And Prisca and Aquila took him because this man knew quite a bit about Jesus and spoke accurately about him. But he only was familiar with the baptism of John. In other words, the baptism for penance, conversion. He was not aware of the baptism that confers the Holy Spirit, sanctifying grace. So Prisca and Aquila, we are told, took him after his discourse in the synagogue. And this was in Ephesus. And they instructed him more fully on the way of the Lord, and the way that was called, like the church was called the way. And then when he wanted to cross over to from Asia Minor, from Ephesus to Achaia, they sent word to the disciples there to receive him, and he was kind of important in this early phase of of evangelization. So they appear 7 times. This couple, Prisca and Aquila, they're mentioned 7 times in the New Testament, and most significantly in the letter of St. Paul to the Romans. They have returned by this time to Rome. They had originally come from Rome, but when Claudius, the emperor, expelled the Jews from the city of Rome in the year 49, that is when they migrated to Corinth, where they met St. Paul. So St. Paul is writing to them there back in Rome, and at the end of the great letter of Paul to the Romans, there is a chapter, the final chapter, in which he extends greetings to the different people. And the first people that he wants to remember are Prisca and Aquila, and the church which is in their home. They risked their necks to save my life. That apparently refers, I think, to the famous riot in Ephesus when St. Paul was almost lynched by the crowd, but apparently saved, perhaps by Prisca and Aquila. And anyway, he says not only he, but all of the churches of the Gentiles owe them a debt of gratitude. So these are the kinds of people when we think of the church of the early days as the church of the apostles, which is of course true. We think primarily of Peter and Paul, but it's also the church of these ordinary people, like this married couple, Prisca and Aquila. You get a little bit of this sense in one of the more beautiful descriptions of this early Christian life, which is given about less than 100 years later, the 2nd century, in a letter called the Epistle to Diognetus, Diognetus was a pagan, apparently, who wrote to this anonymous Christian asking for a description. Give me a description of this new religion. There were lots of new religions that had come from the East, Oriental religions we call them, and were becoming popular in Rome. And Christianity was one of them. And so this man said, well, I know about Mithraism and I know about these other cults. Give me a description of the worship and of the Christians. And the answer that is known as the letter to Diognetus says in its 5th chapter, Christians are not different from other people in nationality, speech, or customs. They do not live in states or cities of their own, nor do they use any special language, nor do they adapt a peculiar way of life. Their teaching is not the kind of thing that could be discovered by the wisdom or reflection of mere active-minded men. Whether fortune has given them a home or a Greek or a foreign city, they follow local custom in the matter of dress, food, and way of life. Yet the character of the culture they reveal is marvelous, and it must be admitted unusual. They live each in his native land, but as though they were not really at home there. They share in all duties like citizens and suffer all hardships like strangers. Every foreign land is for them a fatherland, and every fatherland a foreign land. And it goes on. They marry like other people. They beget children, but they do not abandon their children, which was a kind of a common practice in ancient times, exposing infants. They didn't really have, that was kind of their form of way of abortion. They obey the laws that men make, but their lives are better than these laws. Goes on like that until it comes to the end of the paragraph and says, in a word, what the soul is to the body, Christians are to the world. A very famous kind of pronouncement, which you might say, where was the inspiration for that? For saying what the soul is to the body, the Christians are to the world. And probably it's what Jesus says, that you are the salt of the earth, what keeps the world from going bad, from corruption. So this is the Christian life of the first generations. And of course, in the in the Roman canon of the Mass, we commemorate the first disciples of Peter, first successors of Peter, Linus, Cletus, Sixtus. And there is a line of successors of Peter, which is given to us by St. Irenaeus in the middle of the 2nd century, when he is giving instructions on how you can tell, how you might know what is the teaching that Jesus entrusted to the apostles. Because, of course, there are many at that point in the middle of the 2nd century when Irenaeus was, he was from Asia Minor, but he was a bishop in Roman Gaul, in Lyon. And he was dealing with this popular heresy of the 2nd century, which we refer to as with the name of Gnosticism. And how can you know what is the true teaching of Jesus? What did he really give the apostles? And well, you want to go to the churches, Irenaeus says, that were founded by the apostles. And the simplest thing is to go to the Church of Rome, founded by St. Peter. And he gives all of the line of successors of Peter down to Eleutherius, who was the bishop there in Rome in late 2nd century, when Irenaeus was writing his Adversus Hereses, against the heresies. So that was the touchstone. That was the guarantor of orthodoxy, the teaching that comes down to us in the Church of Rome. Rome, of course, now is, the world is Rome at this point. The world is the Mediterranean world. I mean, it's not just Italy and Gaul, and the boundaries are roughly the Rhine River, north, south, the Danube River going east and west. North Africa is part of Rome. It's Roman Africa, the home of Tertullian, Augustine, Cyprian, just thriving Christian church. Spain is its boundary on the west. The British Islands on the north. And it's a totalitarian regime, which what that means doesn't mean that it's necessarily oppressive, but that there's only one allegiance which is recognized: Dea Roma. Rome is God. And the emperor, the commander-in-chief, is its personification. And this totalitarian allegiance will be the motive for conflict with the growing Christian religion. Grows very, very fast. And around the year 107, this is around the time that Ignatius, the third bishop of Antioch, successor of Peter, in the city of Antioch, where in Syria, where the disciples were first given the name of Christians, as we read in the Acts of the Apostles. Ignatius is taken prisoner and brought to Rome. In the course of that journey, he writes 7 letters, including a letter to the church in Rome, which are among the more valuable, treasured documents of the early church, of the Church of the Apostolic Fathers. Letters, these you can be used, you can read these as spiritual reading. They're wonderful. And as he is being taken to Rome, the governor of a province in Asia Minor, the province of Bithynia, his name is Pliny, P-L-I-N-Y, Pliny. There's a Pliny the Elder, who was his uncle, who is known, nothing to do with the Christian history, known mostly for his description of the eruption of Vesuvius 40 years earlier. And now Pliny the Younger, he's a member of this senatorial class of Rome, and he's writing to the emperor Trajan, outlining or detailing his policy, which he has had to improvise in dealing with this new sect of people who worship a certain Christus. Tacitus, writing around the same time, the historian of Rome, also refers to this mischievous superstition of Christus. Anyway, so Pliny says, this is what I'm doing when these people are denounced. I give them the opportunity to pay homage to the gods of Rome. And if they do, I let them go. If they do not, if they persist in their mischievous superstition, I will release them for execution. And he writes to the emperor just to get approval of his policy. This is kind of the first knowledge that we have of a persecution that breaks out early in the 2nd century. This is just in just shortly after the year 100. Other persecutions during this first period of the church, this first age of the church, are sporadic, local. not worldwide or empire-wide. And they are motivated normally by local rumors, which say these are dangerous people. They are atheists, asevea, because they do not honor the gods of Rome, and they are immoral. Who knows? They seem even to practice some kind of maybe incestuous relationships. They're all brothers and sisters, and they even seem to perform cannibalistic orgies, the Eucharist, eating the flesh of some other. These are kind of the wild rumors that circulate in some places that lead to local outbreaks of opposition. But it's not a policy at this point, in the 2nd century, of the government itself of Rome. That only begins to take shape in the middle of the 3rd century, around the year 250, under the Emperor Decius, especially in North Africa. And that's where we begin to have some of the first great martyrs of the church, principally Saint Cyprian of Carthage. And then there's periods of relative peace for the Christians until the end of the 3rd century, about 15 or maybe 18 years into the reign of Diocletian, the last of the great emperors, who succeeds in, well, I must say that there haven't been any great emperors for a long time, because throughout the 3rd century, the Rome was not able to handle the problem of succession, leadership, and most every emperor did not die in bed, but did not die a natural death. And there was a great many people who were briefly emperors and succumbed to their rivals. And then at the end, Diocletian sort of puts some order into the system, divides the empire into an east and west, a Greek east and a Latin west. Each one will be ruled by a co-emperor and assisted by a Caesar who will succeed that the co-emperor. So that's a tetrarchy, it's called, 4 leaders. And this is the system that is in place around the year 292, or around, let's say, the year 300, when the last of the great persecutions is unleashed, where most of the people that we revere as martyrs Christian martyrs, they suffered and died during this last of the great persecutions. Diocletian is eventually succeeded by Constantine the Great, son of Constantius Chlorus, who was sympathetic to Christianity, who is a pagan, but who was the Caesar in Britain and Gaul. And his son, Constantine the Great, overcomes the rivals to the throne and becomes the sole emperor after what is known as the Battle of Milvian Bridge near near where the Cava Bianca, the center of studies in Rome, our center of studies. And that's from that moment on, Constantine, remember he recognizes the cross in hoc signo vinces. In this sign you will conquer. This is the story that he does not become himself a Christian at that moment. His mother is, Mother Helen, is a great saint. He remains sort of on the ambiguous until he's close to death, when he is finally baptized. Although I must say he was baptized by an Arian bishop. What does that mean? Well, that brings us to the beginning of the second age of the church. Let me go back and backtrack and say, what are the 6 ages of the church? Because we just finished kind of a summary of the first age. This isn't, for me, it's an easy way of summarizing, of kind of getting a hold on the history of the church. How can we do this in just a few minutes? Well, I'll show you how. One, we have the church of the apostles and the martyrs. And this goes from, the birth of our Lord, 4 BC, to the Edict of Milan, 313. The Edict of Milan was the edict issued by Constantine, the emperor in the West, and his colleague in the East, Licinius, granting religious freedom to all peoples, including Christians. So it's not a it's not a doctrine, a document, or an edict by which the state adopts Christianity, but it simply allows Christians to live, to exist, to function. So this is the first age of the church. The second age of the church is the church well, let's put it this way. The church under thank you, on the right. All right. Oh, yeah. The church under the protection of the Roman Empire. This is the next 300 years. And whereas the apostles and the martyrs were the chief protagonists of that first age, as well as ordinary Christians like those tent makers, Prisca and Aquila, the main protagonists in this second age are the people that we refer to as the fathers, church fathers. For the most part, they are in the Greek-speaking world, the eastern part of the Mediterranean. And even those who live in the West, the Greek is the language of the church up at least until the year 300. The next age of the church, I'm going to focus mostly on the West, the Latin. This is the church in the age of the conversion of the north and west. Which is largely from the time of 600, the age of Gregory the Great, Pope Gregory the Great, to the end of the millennium. So this is what is accomplished here is a conversion of the barbarian peoples. Back here, and under Rome, roughly from the early 400s, the empire is overwhelmed by Germanic peoples, Goths. They are given names. Some of them are called East Goths, Ostrogoths, West Goths, Visigoths, Burgundians, Vandals, Suevi, all different kinds of names. They didn't, but they're just people, hordes of people moving west, overwhelming the whatever garrisons there are along the Rhine and Danube. At first, they've been let in across the Danube as allies to be able to be recruited into the Roman legions, to the point where, as maybe in the 3rd century, in some army units, you had to give orders in Germanic language. They didn't understand it. They didn't understand Latin. So the army was becoming, you might say, Germanized, barbarized. What do you mean by barbarian? It would mean people who they're not civilized in the sense civilized comes from civitas. They're not city people. They are nomadic, agrarian people, nomadic, they move about, they don't have a kind of a fixed way of life. And from the early 400s, they are they pour into Roman Gaul, and it's not. Sometimes you read of them as barbarian invasions. They weren't invasions. They weren't interested in conquering. They just wanted the good life. They wanted the Riviera. They wanted the sun. They've been living in these wooded swamps in Germany. These people have really great, and so they come to, like New York or they're not interested in conquest. They're going to take over, and eventually they do. And so then the churches face, we got these people. They originally were baptized. They originally were converted by an Arian bishop named Ulfila. And so all of them all these Gothic tribes, nations, have adopted the Arian version of Christianity, which I'll come to in just a moment. Only the one that were Catholic from the beginning were the Franks. They were kind of the last of these, not the last, but one of the later nations to move across the Rhine up in the north near Belgium. And they were Catholic from the beginning. But that's what is important, because the Franks are the ones who are going to take over all of the Western Europe. Gaul, the Franks will give their name to France and Spain and Portugal, and eventually their great leader, their great king will be Charles the Great, Charlemagne. That's 200 or 300 years later, at least 800. So the church is faced with a tremendous challenge. What do you do with these people? They've got good instincts. They've got good kind of good. They're respectful of women. They've got good things about these nomadic barbarian peoples. But well, they're very messy, and they tend to be rather violent. They're warriors. That's their way of life, and that gives a kind of a character to the civilization that they create, the medieval civilization of the next several centuries. We probably should take a break at some point so I can collect my thoughts. See, where do I go from here? So we'll take 5 minutes.